The dog wouldn't look at its handler. That was the first thing anyone noticed. Not the crowd of 300 people standing in crisp morning air outside the federal building in downtown Denver. Not the flags at half-staff snapping in the October wind. Not even the 7 German shepherds sitting in perfect formation at the base of the memorial wall, their coats gleaming under the pale autumn sun. What people noticed, the ones paying close enough attention, was that a dog named Cinder kept turning her head. Not toward the crowd, not toward the cameras set up along the perimeter, toward something at the far edge of the plaza, near the concrete benches where a few older attendees had chosen to sit rather than stand. Cinder's nostrils worked in small, rapid pulses. Her ears swiveled like satellite dishes catching a distant signal. Her handler, a young officer named Sergeant Flores, tugged the leash once, she corrected, sat straight, but her eyes kept pulling to the left. Then the wind shifted and Cinder stood up. Not lunged, not barked, simply stood the way a dog stands when something ancient in its brain overrides everything it has been trained to do. The leash went taut. Sergeant Flores grabbed it with both hands, and then the dog beside Cinder, a male named Axel, 4 years old, 17 months active service, did the same thing. Then the third dog, then the fourth. Within 11 seconds, all 7 K9s in the formation had risen to their feet and were pulling hard in the same direction, toward the edge of the crowd, toward a woman none of the officers had noticed before. A woman in her late 20s wearing a canvas work jacket, 2 sizes too large, standing alone near the back of the plaza with her hands in her pockets, watching the ceremony with the quiet, careful eyes of someone who had learned a long time ago not to take up too much space. Nobody knew who she was. Nobody had asked. Her name was Nadia Forsythe, and she had driven 4 hours that morning from a property outside Pueblo that barely qualified as a farm anymore. 12 acres of dry grass, a sagging fence line, and a barn that needed a new roof she couldn't afford. She hadn't planned to come. She hadn't been invited. She had seen the notice for the Denver K9 Memorial dedication in the back pages of a law enforcement newsletter that a former colleague had forwarded by mistake, and she had sat with it for 3 days before she got in her truck and drove north. She stood at the back of the crowd because she wasn't sure she belonged at the front. She was 28 years old. She had no badge, no uniform, no rank to her name. What she had was a way with dogs that people had been calling uncanny since she was 9 years old. Following her father across the fields of their property in southern Colorado, while he worked with the rescue animals he took in during the winters, she had grown up understanding that a frightened dog wasn't a broken dog. That aggression was almost always fear wearing a different coat, that the animals other people gave up on were often the ones with the most left to give. She had started formally training dogs at 22, working out of that same Pueblo property after her father passed, using the skills he had spent years passing down to her. Not military dogs at first. Rescue animals, shelter dogs on their last week, dogs that other trainers had labeled too damaged, too reactive, too far gone. She would bring them back slowly, working in the early mornings before the heat came, building trust the same way her father had taught her. Not with force, not with fear, but with patience so quiet, it looked like nothing at all from the outside. Word spread the way it does in small communities. A sheriff's deputy in Pueblo County brought her a Belgian Malinois that had washed out of a federal K9 program after biting 2 handlers. She spent 4 months with that dog. When she was done, it was the best performing search dog in the county. After that, she started getting calls from further away, from programs in New Mexico, Kansas, Wyoming, and eventually, through a contact she had made at a regional law enforcement conference, from a federal K9 training coordinator in Denver named Chief Harold Sutter. Chief Sutter had a problem. He had 8 German shepherds, imported working-line dogs from a breeding program in the Czech Republic, that had arrived in Colorado with exceptional drive, exceptional intelligence, and a level of reactivity that had already burned through 2 rounds of experienced handlers. The dogs weren't broken. Chief Sutter knew that. But they were wired tight, high-voltage animals that had been pushed too hard, too fast, in environments that hadn't accounted for what they actually needed. They weren't failing because they lacked ability. They were failing because nobody had taken the time to teach them to trust. He called Nadia on a Thursday afternoon. She arrived the following Monday. She came alone, in the same truck she drove everywhere, and she didn't bring anything with her except a worn duffel bag and the kind of stillness that some people are born with and others spend their whole lives trying to manufacture. Chief Sutter walked her through the facility. She asked a few questions. Then she asked to spend 30 minutes alone in the yard with the dogs before anyone told her anything else about them. Chief Sutter started to object. His training coordinator, a veteran handler named Officer Bright, told her it wasn't protocol. She nodded and said she understood, and then she looked at Chief Sutter in a way that made him wave Officer Bright off and open the gate. 30 minutes later, when the chief came back out, Nadia Forsythe was sitting cross-legged in the dirt with 2 of the 8 dogs leaning against her, and she hadn't done a single thing he could point to as remarkable. She had just sat there breathing, slowly, waiting. "How long do you need with them?" Chief Sutter asked. She looked up at him, shading her eyes against the afternoon's sun. "How long can you give me?" He gave her 8 months. She came every weekday, sometimes staying until dark, working each dog individually, and then in pairs, and then as a group, building the kind of structure these animals needed, clear, consistent, patient, without ever tipping over into the rigidity that had broken them down before. She kept notes in a spiral-bound notebook she carried in her jacket pocket. Not data, not metrics, just observations. Things she noticed, the way one dog relaxed when approached from the left instead of the right, the way another needed 5 full minutes of stillness before it could engage. Small things, the things that only matter if you're paying attention. By month 3, Chief Sutter's training coordinator had stopped objecting to her methods. By month 6, the dogs were performing at levels that were turning heads within the federal program. By month 8, 7 of the 8 dogs had been certified and placed with active K9 units across Colorado, Wyoming, and New Mexico. One of them, a female named Cinder, was assigned to a Denver unit. The others went to agencies in Cheyenne, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, Fort Collins, and Colorado Springs. The 8th dog washed out, not from any failure of temperament, but from a congenital hip condition that hadn't been caught during the original import screening. Nadia drove him back to Pueblo and kept him. He slept at the foot of her bed and had never been calmer in his life. When the 8 months were up, Chief Sutter shook her hand and told her she was the best dog trainer he had worked with in 30 years. He meant it. He also knew, in the way that bureaucracies tend to work, that her contract was over, and there was no line item in the federal budget for whatever it was she did that nobody else could quite define. She drove back to Pueblo. She went back to her 12 acres and her sagging fence and her barn that needed a new roof. She didn't hear from Chief Sutter's office again. That was 14 months ago. The ceremony had been going for 40 minutes when the dogs stood up. Nadia saw it happen before the crowd did. She had been watching Cinder from the moment she arrived, recognizing the dog's gait, the particular way she held her head slightly to the right when she was alert. Cinder had always been the most sensitive of the 8, the one whose emotional temperature ran highest, the one who felt things first and processed them after. Nadia had spent more hours with Cinder than with any of the others. She hadn't expected the dog to recognize her from this distance. The wind was moving the wrong direction, and it had been over a year. She had positioned herself at the back of the crowd, precisely so that wouldn't happen. She didn't want to disrupt anything. She had come because she needed to see them. Just see them, from a distance, know they were okay, and then she was going to get back in her truck and drive home. But the wind shifted, and Cinder's head turned, Nadia took a step back, pressing into the crowd, trying to make herself smaller. But 7 trained K9s don't lose a scent once they've found it, and within seconds the entire formation was in motion, pulling hard against leashes held by handlers who were thoroughly confused and just starting to be alarmed. The crowd parted. People stepped aside, and 7 German shepherds converged on the back of the plaza, with a singular, focused intensity that made a retired police captain near the front of the audience later describe it as the most coordinated thing he'd ever seen 7 dogs do without being commanded. They found her near the concrete benches. Cinder reached her first, pressing hard against her legs, whining in the high, desperate register that means something very specific in a dog. Not fear, not aggression, but the breaking down of a structure that has been held carefully in place for a long time. Nadia crouched without thinking, her hands going to Cinder's face, and the dog went quiet instantly, pressing her forehead against Nadia's collarbone the way she always had when she needed to be still. The other 6 arrived in the next several seconds, all of them crowding in, some whining, one of them, Axel, making a low sound in his chest that wasn't quite a bark and wasn't quite a cry but something in between. The handlers stood back. They didn't know what else to do. A woman near the middle of the crowd said, quietly, "Who is she?" Nobody answered. The senior official at the ceremony was a deputy director of federal law enforcement training named Gerald Pruitt, 61 years old, 28 years in, and not easily impressed. He had spent enough time around working dogs to understand what he was seeing, which was why he crossed the plaza himself rather than sending a staffer. He stopped a few feet away from where Nadia was still crouched in the middle of the 7 dogs, running her hands over each of them in turn, checking them the way she always checked dogs after time apart. Feeling for anything that had changed, any tension in the muscle, any stiffness in the gait. She wasn't performing. She wasn't aware of the 300 people watching her. She was just doing what she did. "Ma'am," Deputy Director Pruitt said. She looked up. There was a smear of dog saliva on her jacket. She didn't seem to notice. "Can I ask who you are?" She stood slowly. Axel moved with her, staying pressed to her left side. "Nadia Forsythe," she said. "I trained these dogs about 1.5 years ago, before they were certified." Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the 7 dogs, still clustered around this young woman in the too large jacket, like they were never going to let her leave. Then he looked back at her. "You trained all 7 of them?" "8, she said. "1 didn't make the program. I kept him." Pruitt was quiet. Behind him, the crowd had gone completely still. The official program had stopped entirely. The speakers at the podium were not speaking. Everyone was watching. "Why didn't you come to the ceremony?" Pruitt asked. "You would have been on the list." Nadia looked at him steadily. "Nobody called me." Pruitt didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Where are you based?" "Pueblo. I drove up this morning. How long have you been here?" "About an hour. I was going to leave after the ceremony. I didn't want to interrupt anything." Pruitt looked at her for another long moment. He was the kind of man who had learned in a long career to tell the difference between people performing humility and people who simply didn't need an audience. This woman was the latter. He could see it in the way she stood, the way the dogs around her had settled from their frantic reunion into a calm, easy attentiveness, all 7 of them tuned to her the way antennae tune to a signal. "We'd like you to come up to the front," he said. She shook her head slightly. "I'm fine back here. Ms. Forsythe," he said it gently. "These dogs just stopped a federal memorial ceremony to find you. I think you've earned a spot at the front." What happened next was not scripted and not planned and not the kind of thing that ends up in official ceremony reports. Deputy Director Pruitt walked Nadia Forsythe to the front of the crowd with all 7 K9s, orbiting her like planets around a sun, and when she reached the base of the memorial wall, where the names of fallen officers were carved into the granite, he turned to face the assembled guests and introduced her. He did not have notes. He spoke from what she had just told him, and from what he had watched happen in the plaza, and from the way the dogs were still pressed against her legs, like they intended to stay there for the rest of their lives. He told the audience that the 7 canines being honored that day had come into the federal training program as animals that multiple experienced handlers had been unable to work with, that they had been sent to a trainer in Pueblo, Colorado, a young woman who had spent 8 months rebuilding what fear and pressure had broken down, that every dog being honored at this ceremony had passed through her hands first, that without her work none of them would be here. Nadia stood very still while he talked. She didn't look at the crowd, she looked at Cinder, who was sitting beside her left foot with her head pressed against Nadia's knee, and she kept one hand resting on the dog's head, steadying both of them. When Pruett finished, the applause started slowly and then built, the way things build when they're real and unplanned. Not the polite acknowledgement of something expected, but the sound of 300 people recalibrating what they thought they understood. A photographer for the Denver Post, who had been assigned to cover the ceremony, took a picture at exactly that moment. Nadia Forsythe, standing at the memorial wall with 7 German shepherds arranged around her, and the morning light coming in at a low angle, and the crowd behind her, most of them no longer sure whether to clap or just stand there in silence. That photograph ran on the front page of the paper the next morning. After the ceremony, Chief Sutter found her near the parking area, loading a water bowl back into her truck for the dog she had brought with her. The 8th one, the one with the bad hips, who had ridden 4 hours in the back seat that morning because she didn't like leaving him alone. "Nadia," Chief Sutter said. She looked up. Her expression was neutral. She wasn't angry. She wasn't performing forgiveness. She was just there, the way she was always just there. "I should have called you," he said. "When we started planning this, you should have been invited. It's okay. It isn't." She was quiet for a moment. The 8th dog, whose name was 8 because she had never felt right, giving him a call name that belonged to a mission he never got to run, pressed his nose against the truck window from the inside. "They did well," she said finally. "That's what matters. All 7 of them." Sutter looked at her. He was 63 years old and had spent his career in federal law enforcement, and there were not many things left that made him feel like he had gotten something significantly wrong. "I want to talk to you about something. When you have time." "I have time now. There's a new cohort coming in. 16 dogs, mostly Czech import, some Dutch, coming in January. We've been having trouble finding the right." He stopped. Started again. "We've been looking for someone, for months, and I keep thinking about those 8 dogs." Nadia looked at 8 through the truck window. He had his tongue out. He was not a dignified animal. She loved him completely. "What's the contract?" she said. "We'd want you on site 4 days a week. We can build a formal consulting structure. Benefits, the whole thing this time." He paused. "Not 8 months. We're thinking multi-year." She was quiet for a long time. The parking lot was emptying out around them. The October sun was starting to warm the pavement, and somewhere in the distance a flag was snapping in the wind. "Can I bring 8?" she said. Sutter looked at the dog in the truck. 8 looked back at him with cheerful incomprehension. "That's going to require some paperwork." "That's a yes, then." Sutter almost smiled. "That's a yes." She nodded slowly. Then she turned back to the truck and ran her hand along 8's outline through the window, the same way she did every time she needed to feel where things stood. 4 hours south, the 12 acres and the sagging fence and the barn with the leaking roof were going to sit there a little longer. They had waited this long. The photograph ran, as mentioned, on the front page of the Denver Post. It was picked up by 2 wire services the next day. By the end of the week, it had traveled to outlets in 11 states. The caption identified Nadia Forsythe as a dog trainer from Pueblo, Colorado. It mentioned that she had trained all 7 of the canines being honored at the ceremony. It noted that she had come to the event alone, had stood at the back and had not been on the official program. The comments, as comments do, went in every direction. But the ones that kept rising to the top said variations of the same thing, that the dogs had known, that all the ceremony and the speeches and the official recognition in the world couldn't manufacture what those 7 animals had done in 11 seconds at the back of a plaza in downtown Denver. That some kinds of loyalty don't follow a program, that a dog trained with patience and treated with respect doesn't forget who gave it those things. Even after a year in the field, even in the middle of a formal ceremony, even when the person responsible for everything they'd become was standing quietly at the back of the crowd in a canvas jacket, trying not to take up too much space. Deputy Director Pruitt, in a brief statement to the Post 2 days after the ceremony, said that his office was actively working to ensure that the contribution of trainers like Miss Forsythe was recognized within the formal structure of federal K-9 programs going forward. It was the kind of sentence that could mean a lot or a little, depending on who was reading it. Nadia didn't read it. She had driven back to Pueblo the afternoon of the ceremony and was up before 5 the next morning, the same as always, working in the early quiet before the heat came, because there were 3 new dogs arriving from a shelter in Trinidad that week, and they were going to need a lot of patience and a lot of time, and someone who understood that what looked like damage from the outside was almost never the whole story. 8 limped happily alongside her through the morning grass, his bad hips slowing him down but not stopping him, the way it goes when you have somewhere you want to be and someone you trust to walk with. The sun came up slow and orange over the eastern ridge, the same as it always had, and Nadia Forsythe moved through it the way she moved through everything, quietly, steadily, without needing anyone to watch.